Welcome back everybody, my name is Nick and this is Swiftful Thinking, and this is yet another video in this playlist on accessibility. So 2 videos back we talked about dynamic text and making our text resizable. In the last video we talked about dynamic colors and making sure we have a good color scheme. In this video we're going to talk about VoiceOver. So this is not related to the last 2 videos at all. So the last 2 videos users were actually going to see the screen. In this video, VoiceOver is primarily for users who can't see the screen. So people who are blind should still be able to use your app. And in this video, we're going to talk about how to use VoiceOver and how to add VoiceOver commands into our app. This is something that can be very frustrating if you've never done it before, but I promise you, once we get through it and you get the hang of it, it's not going to be that difficult and it'll only take you a couple minutes to add VoiceOver support to your screens. Welcome back everyone. We are doing another accessibility video here. This one is much more intricate, a little more unique. This one took me a while to try to figure out because if you've never used VoiceOver before, VoiceOver is very hard to use. It's super counterintuitive because VoiceOver is made to make the app easy to use. Anyway, let's actually take a look at how to use VoiceOver. Then we're going to take a look at how to make our app accessible so that people can use VoiceOver with our apps. But first, let's right-click the navigator, create a new file. It'll be a Swift UI view, and let's call this one Accessibility VoiceOver Bootcamp. Let's get our simulator going here, and we're going to build out a screen before we actually do anything. So I'm going to do a little bit of project setup here. Bear with me, guys. Let's create a navigation stack. And inside the navigation stack, let's create a form. Open the brackets. A form is kind of like a list. And inside the form, we're going to create a couple sections. So the first section of the form, we're going to have content. We're also going to have a header. So we'll come down to the content and header. Press enter on the content. And let's add in a toggle here. I'm going to use the default title and is on initializer here. Let's just say maybe volume. We'll pretend like there's like a volume toggle. And let's create an @state private var is active of type bool, set it equal to false. Let's bind to that with the $ is active. Let's also create our own custom toggle. So we're going to do an H stack here with some text that says volume. I'll add maybe a spacer. And on the right side, I'm going to put another text that says if is active is true. Let's say on, if is active is false, otherwise we'll do off. All right, and then I'm going to add a .onTap gesture, and on tap gesture we will call is active .toggle. So when we tap our toggle, it's going to toggle this. When we tap our H stack, it's going to also toggle this. So in the header, let's just put a text that says maybe preferences. Just as like some sample text, and let's see what that looks like on our screen real quick. Cool. All right, let's see if I tap this, it works. If I tap this, it works. If I tap in the middle here, this white area, it does not work. It does not work, and that's because there's no background on this custom H stack. So if I just add here a background of color.red, you can see where it's about to go. And then I'm just going to make it black, opacity 0.001. All right, so now I can't see it, but I can still tap here. Anyway, all right. First section is done. Let's add a couple more sections before we actually get into our accessibility. I'm going to add another section here. So underneath this one, let's add in a section. This time, let's again do a section with a header. Cool. I'm going to add a button here. Let's use the initializer with just a title and action. The title will be favorites. Maybe it's the favorites button. And an action, but we're not going to add an action yet. I'm going to add another button. This time let's do the action and the label. I'm not going to add an action yet, but for this label let's just do maybe a image with a system name of maybe heart.fill. And let's do another text down here that says favorites. And this time I'll add an on tap gesture because it's not a button, but I'll add a tap gesture onto this text. In this header, I'm going to put a text that just says maybe application, just another little section here. And then we're going to wrap this up with one more section, but this time I'm not going to actually add a section. I'm going to add in a VStack. And let's see here. At the top of the VStack, we'll add a little bit of text that says maybe content. This will be the content section. I'm going to give it a frame with a max width of infinity and an alignment of leading, so it's on the left edge. Let's give this a foreground of secondary. Let's give this a font of caption, just so it kind of looks like this application and this preferences. I'm just going to make it look like kind of like that. It says content though. And then below that text, we're going to add some content. Let's do a scroll view because we haven't done one of those yet. I'm going to use this completion. I'm going to hold the option button and click enter so I get the full completion here. Let's make this a horizontal scroll view. Let's not show the indicators, so false, and then some content here. Now I'm going to create a couple cells. I don't really care what they look like, but let's create an H stack, maybe some spacing of 8. Let's do a for each in here, and again, just do for each 0 to less than 10, just so we get some cells on the screen. And let's just call this X for each index we're looping on. And each one, let's just put maybe a V stack. I'm going to put an image here. And I'm going to look at my assets folder real quick. I have an image called Steve-Jobs. It's from a previous video in the series. Any image you have will work. I'm just going to use this one for now. Image Steve-Jobs. Let's get that on the screen. All right, let's make it resizable and scale it to fill. Let's give it a frame, maybe 100 by 100, just so that we can see it for a little bit. Maybe a little bit of a corner radius of 10. That is looking pretty sweet, I think at least. Below this, let's put a little text that just says item with maybe a colon with maybe the number that we are looping on. So just item 1, item 2, item 3. I don't really care what it says, right? But in your app, you're probably going to have some UI with a bunch of cells. They'll each have their own text. So now we have a cell here, one text, different text, different text, just to kind of mimic what a real app situation might look like. These are not buttons, so I'm just going to also add on a tap gesture here, and let's go from there. Let's wrap this up with, on the bottom of this form here, let's give it a nav title. Let's just say settings. Maybe it's our settings screen. And that's enough setup. All right, we did a couple minutes of setup here. Sorry, guys, but now we're going to talk a lot about VoiceOver, and we're going to play around with this screen here. The reason I did it this way is because I think a lot of times you're going to build your app, or you're going to have an app already made, and then you're going to decide, all right, now it's time to add VoiceOver, and we have to adjust our existing UI to support VoiceOver. So before we even do that, let's talk a little bit about what VoiceOver is. First and foremost, if you've never used VoiceOver before, I would say probably go ahead and Google it. VoiceOver is a gesture-based screen reader. Basically, you can use the app and you can use the iPhone without even seeing the screen. So this is perfect for someone who is maybe blind, but there's also other reasons to use VoiceOver. It's not just for blind people. But if you open up your iPhone, and I'm going to manually use my iPhone for the rest of this tutorial, you guys can't actually see it because I'm going to use a physical iPhone, but you should be able to hear it as I scroll through it. So as I scroll through my iPhone, I will show you what I'm actually clicking on or looking at. And you could do the same on your personal device. But if you go into your iPhone, you click on settings, and you go down to accessibility, there's at the very top, there's VoiceOver, and then you can turn VoiceOver on. Once you turn VoiceOver on, there is a VoiceOver practice button, which you are more than welcome to go and practice on your own time. If you Google how to use VoiceOver, like there are tons of tutorials. I am not going to go through all of the steps. I don't even know all of the steps, but I know at least the basics. I'm going to give you guys a couple tips that I do before we move forward. Firstly, if you swipe right or swipe left, you kind of move to the next item. If you swipe up or down, you move to the next section. If you just tap a certain item, you can kind of jump to that item. And then if you clicked on an item and you double tap on that item, you can select it. So I can turn VoiceOver off and on by double tapping on that toggle. Generally, VoiceOver is incredibly frustrating if you do not know how to use it. One really quick tip is that you can ask Siri to turn it on or off. So if you have Siri on, it's much easier. I'll open up my app directly, and then I will just say, hey Siri, turn on VoiceOver, and then use my app. And that's what I'm going to do right now. So I'm going to actually take this accessibility voiceover bootcamp. I'm going to make this the first app in my project here, and I'm going to build this to my iPhone, and let's build and run. Yes, my iPhone is called Not Your iPhone because it is not your iPhone, it is my iPhone. But let's build it real quick. And I'm going to turn up the volume so maybe you can hear my Siri. That might help you out here. So I have my app built on my device here. I'm going to say, hey Siri, turn on VoiceOver. All right, I got a little pop-up that looks like the toggle is on. I'm going to swipe up once from the bottom so it dismisses, and I'm now in my app. And you should be able to hear as I click through it, the first thing is the settings.
Settings, heading.
And you'll notice that when I click on something, it first tells me what that item is, and then it tells me the traits of that item. So it says settings, and then it says heading.
Settings, heading.
Now I'm going to swipe right on my phone. So right now I'm clicked on this settings. So right now I'm clicked on settings. I'm going to swipe right.
Preferences, heading.
It's down to preferences, which is also a heading. I'm going to swipe right one more time. It should go to this first volume line here.
Volume, switch button, off. Double tap to toggle setting.
All right, so it's telling me I can double tap to turn it on. I'm going to double tap on the screen.
On.
And now I'm going to double tap, turn it off.
Off.
All right, now I'm going to swipe right one more time. It should go to the second volume row here.
Volume.
Now when I went to the first row, it clicked on this entire row. It told me it was a toggle, and I could double tap to turn on or off. When I went to the second row, it only selected this text here. But really, I wanted to select this entire row, and I wanted to tell me what this row can do if I click on it or not. But all it did was say...
Volume.
Right, so again, if I go back to the first row...
Volume. Switch button, off. Double tap to toggle setting.
I go to the second row.
Volume.
That's all I get. And that's because the way we built our screen here we use the default native component of a toggle. Here we use an H stack that we just are tapping on. It's not even a button, and it just says volume. Now if I swipe right from this word volume,
off,
it just goes to this off. So it goes from here to here. So it's kind of connected, but that's not a use case for someone who's blind. If someone was blind and not looking at the screen, they wanted to say what the default toggle said, right? The default toggle said, here, this is a toggle. You could double tap, turn on or off. This is the volume button. That's what we want our app to be able to do. So the first thing that's very obvious here is if you're using native Apple components, like the toggle, those are going to have accessibility support by default. So more and more, we have more and more reasons all the time to actually use native components. Now, in this HStack, we built our own custom toggle, and it works in our app, right, when I click on it. But for accessibility purposes, it does not work right now. So now we have to add custom code to make this volume row actually work for VoiceOver. So again, if you can use this in your app or the native components in your app, use them. They save us so much time and effort as a developer. But if you have to build out custom components, we're going to go through now how we can actually customize some of this. So first and foremost, when we clicked on this volume down here, it just said volume. It did not group this volume with this off button. But I wanted to group all of this, just like when I went to this first row, it grouped the toggle and the volume as one component. Because here it is actually one component, but here it's a bunch of different items. So what I can actually do is on this HStack, I can add a modifier. And let's put it maybe, I think we can put it after all of the tap gesture. Let's add a accessibility element. And I'm going to look for the children. So this is going to be on this entire object here. We're going to call the children, and we're going to say combine the children. All right, so now I'm going to run my project one more time.
Preferences, heading.
All right, now I'm going to go to the first volume row again.
Volume, switch button, off. Double tap to toggle setting.
And now I'm going to go to the second row, which now should have both the volume and the on-off grouped together.
Volume, off.
Perfect. So now we have this whole row as one single object, and it didn't say like toggle to turn on or off or anything like that. All right, so we've grouped these objects together. All right, so now I don't have to click on these individually. They're grouped together, but we don't have the same context that this toggle had. This toggle said this is a switch button, toggle it to turn on or off. So on this, we can now tell the system what kind of element this actually is going to be. So here I can add an accessibility add traits, and there's a whole bunch of traits here. And so I'm going to actually make this a button. So now that the user will hear that it is a button, so they'll know that they can click it. So I'm going to build and run this one more time. Now I'm going to click on the first row.
Volume. Switch button. Off. Double tap to toggle setting.
Now I'm going to click on the second row.
Volume. Off. Button.
So now it's at least telling me it's a button. And lastly, I want to add some logic so that it says double tap to toggle the setting or toggle the volume. And so we can add here a accessibility hint. And the hint's going to be double tap to toggle setting. That's what it said in the original. So I'm going to run this again.
Settings. Heading.
I'm going to click on the first one.
Volume. Switch button. Off. Double tap to toggle setting.
Now I'm going to click on the second one.
Volume. Off. Button. Double tap to toggle setting.
All right, so now it's giving feedback to this person who can't see the screen that if this is a button and if they double tap it, it will toggle the setting, right? So this is much more helpful to someone using VoiceOver than the original implementation was. And that was pretty easy to actually update, if you ask me. I want to show you a couple other things that we can really customize here. We don't have to do these, but the tap gesture, I can also add a .accessibility action. So if I want the accessibility action to be different from the default tap gesture, from the default gesture, I can add an accessibility action here. I'm just going to call this isActive.toggle because we don't need it to do anything different. I think generally if you're using accessibility stuff, we probably should just add in the actions anyway, just to be explicit about what we're doing. I think it's probably just a good practice. And the last thing I want to show you guys on this button is the accessibility. Let's add it maybe before we add the hint, we'll add accessibility value. All right, so the value is here, the is on or off is the value. And in our implementation here, we have this button that says on or off, right? Now, so when we are clicking it right now, it's saying volume on or volume off. And that's just because our H stack is perfectly with volume on or off. But there could be a situation where maybe like the text here isn't exactly on or off and it's less descriptive, right? So maybe we had something like, is active true? And then is active false or something like that, right? So if I click it again now.
Volume. False. Button. Double tap to toggle setting.
Right, so volume false is way less descriptive than volume on or volume off, right? But maybe this is the UI that our team wants for some reason. So what I could do instead here, I can make this accessibility hidden. So I put this as true. So this doesn't even appear when I click on it. And instead, I will give it a value. So the value of this button, the current value, the value of on or off, I can put here. And I can put the value as is active. I could say maybe on, otherwise off. So now it's going to say volume on, off. Or it can even get really unique here, and I could say something like volume is on or volume is off. So if I run this now I'm going to click on the volume, the second volume again.
Volume is off. Button. Double tap to toggle setting.
You heard it say volume is off button.
Volume is off. Button. Double tap to toggle setting.
So that is a much more easy to use and descriptive feedback for somebody who cannot see this phone. Volume is off, double tap to toggle setting. That's literally like plain English. And that's all we had to do to support VoiceOver for this object. So circling back here, if you can use the native buttons, do that. But if you cannot, you now know how to basically customize any element. So a lot of times we're making these buttons, but there's also, this is an image, this is a link, this is a modal, this is a search field. And then you can add in a value. If there's a value for that current thing, give it a custom action, give it a custom hint. Then you can add traits as well. Let's move down here to some other examples here. I'm going to go to this favorites button. This is a button, so it's the default native button. So it should have accessibility traits by default. I'm going to click on this button on my screen real quick.
Favorites button.
You'll notice that it said favorites button. So it already had that trait of a button because it's the default button. And I want to show you guys, just in case you wanted to, we can also call accessibility remove traits. And we can remove the fact that it is a button. So if I run this now, it would just say favorites and it would not say button. I don't really want to do that in my project, but this can come in handy for things like maybe you have like images where they're coming up as like image and it's really a button. So you could remove the trait of the image and add a trait of the button, something like that. But if I come down here and I click on this second button, let's click on this heart here. It's just a heart on this button.
Love button. Love button.
It says love button. So that's not exactly what we want. This is, we're going to make this like our favorites button. Even though we're using the heart and it's love, of course, guys, I know it's one love and this could be our love button, but we're trying to make a favorites button here, right? So even though this is so cool that the system is giving us the word love from this system image, there's some default trait here, and it's telling us this is a button, but we want this to really come back as the favorites button. Because maybe, in apps like Tinder or something like that, the button is just a heart and it doesn't actually say favorites or like on it, but it is the like button. And so when we have an icon like this, we can actually go ahead and add an accessibility label. An accessibility label is going to be the default thing that it says when you click on it. So here I'm going to say favorites. So it's going to give it a label that it's called favorites. And then because it's a button, it should know that it's already a button with the button traits. I'm going to build and run this one more time. I'm going to click on the first favorites button here.
Favorites.
And you'll notice that when I clicked on it, it did not say button because we have remove traits, which we probably shouldn't have, but I'm just doing it for the tutorial. And then second one, we have this new button here, which said love button before, and now it says
favorites button.
Favorites button. So it's back to our favorites button, even though it's just the image is just the heart.fill. I'm going to click on this last favorites one now.
Favorites.
And you'll notice again that it does not know that this is a button. So here again, we want to add traits of is button. Cool. All right. Before we move on to this final section, I want to talk a little bit about rotors, accessibility rotors, which are pretty unique. If you have your VoiceOver turned on, if you use two fingers and you rotate them on the screen, literally rotate like a rotor, you can switch the rotors. So what that means is if you don't do anything and you're just using VoiceOver, if you swipe left or right, it moves one item up or down. So I swipe left.
Favorites button.
If I swipe left again.
Favorites.
If I swipe left again.
Application. Heading.
If I swipe left again.
Volume is off button.
If I swipe left again.
Volume. Switch button.
If I swipe left again.
Preferences. Heading.
Right? But if I swipe up or down, it's going to jump from section to section. So right now I'm on this preferences, and if I swipe right, it's going to go here. But if I swipe down, it's going to go to here.
Application. Heading.
Because it's going from heading to heading. So if I switch my rotor by using two fingers and I rotate it, it's going to determine when I'm doing this jump from section to section, what am I jumping by? Am I jumping from heading to heading? Am I jumping from something else to something else? So I'm going to look at the rotors here.
Containers. Headings. Characters. Words. Speaking rate. 50 containers. Headings.
So those are all the rotors that you can jump from. So if I go into words and I swipe down, up or down, it's going to jump from word to word to word. But generally, I think people have this on headings, which is the default state. So we can easily switch from preferences to application in one swoop. So when you have large screens like this and you have all these buttons, instead of having to go from button to button to button, you could jump from heading to heading to heading and then go through the buttons. And the reason I'm coming up with this is because this content here is not a heading. So when we created these sections, we made this a header. And that header by default has a heading trait on it. So when I go from preferences to application, I can swipe up and down.
Preferences. Heading. Application. Heading.
But if I swipe down on application,
Heading not found. Heading not found.
it doesn't know that this content is a heading. So what I want to do down here on this content, I'm going to add an accessibility trait. And let's add is header. So now if I run this, I can go to preferences.
Preferences. Heading.
I'll swipe down to application.
Application. Heading.
And I'll swipe down one more time.
Content. Heading.
And I'm back on the content. So I can add this as a header, which is helpful for the users who are going to be using the accessibility rotors. Now, there are ways to build custom accessibility rotors. I generally have not done that in any apps, so I'm not going to do a tutorial of that right now. But I think this is a really important feature because I think jumping from section to section is a really important use case in your app. So you should be able to understand how to use the headers and then add in these traits so users can jump around. This again is going to go back to if you're using the native components, the native headers, the native footers, those are going to have all the accessibility stuff baked in by default. All right. The last and final thing that we're going to do here is a little test for you guys actually. So I have this scroll view and we have a V stack and there's an image and there's a text and there's a tap gesture. And I would bet you a lot of money that if I go to select some of these and I swipe right on this text, this image here to this image to this image, I bet you it's not going to tell me that this is a button. It's not going to give me a hint of what it does. It's not going to tell me, it's not going to group these objects together. So my challenge to you guys is to go ahead right now, pause this video and try to add kind of the same traits that we added up here for this custom toggle, add that to this custom H stack. So each of these stacks should basically come through as a button. It should give us some information that this is item number X, and maybe the hint is something like double tap to open, because generally this looks like it might segue to another screen. So item 0, double tap to open, and it should obviously be a button because they're going to be clicking on it, right? So you could obviously make this a button, but I'm just going to keep it a tap gesture and challenge you guys to try to add accessibility to these rows. If I click on them right now,
Steve Jobs. Image.
swipe right,
Steve Jobs. Image. Steve Jobs. Image. Steve Jobs. Image. Steve Jobs. Image.
So right now it's going from the image to image to image. It's not even taking into account these. I guess these will come after I get to the last image. So really bad UX right now in terms of VoiceOver, but go ahead and update it. I'm going to actually update it too right now. So pause this video real quick if you want to challenge yourself. Otherwise, let's jump into it. I'm going to do it real quick. We know that we want to group these together, right? So let's add an accessibility element, children. Let's combine them. So now this image and this text is one object. Let's add traits, make sure it's a button so the user knows it's a button. Let's give it a label. So instead of saying Steve Jobs 12 times, let's say item, and let's tell it what item it is, so item X. Let's put a period there and we'll say image of Steve Jobs. So the VoiceOver user is going to hear item 2, image of Steve Jobs. Now, obviously, in your real app, they wouldn't all be Steve Jobs, and you would want to change this as well, but it's fine for us. And let's give it a quick accessibility hint. And let's say maybe double tap to open, because these look like they would, segue somewhere. And then maybe there's an accessibility action, which we are not going to do in this video, but that should be good to at least get us to a usable state, right? It only took us 30 seconds to actually add accessibility now that we know how to do this. Let's build and run it and check it out real quick. All right, and now I'm going to actually challenge myself real quick. So if you have accessibility VoiceOver on, if you take 3 fingers and triple tap the screen, you could turn on screen curtain. So your whole screen will go black. It will literally be like you cannot see your screen for a second. So I'm going to do it because that's going to simulate someone who is actually blind and can't see the screen at all. So I'm going to triple tap my screen with 3 fingers.
Screen curtain on.
Now I can't see anything, but the phone is still there. I'm on the settings right now. I'm going to try to get down to the content. I'm going to swipe through the Steve Jobs pictures. I'm using the rotors. I'm going to swipe down to preferences.
Preferences. Heading.
All right, we're on that heading. Let's go to the next heading.
Application. Heading.
All right, let's try to go to the last heading.
Content. Heading.
All right, now that I'm on my content, I'm going to swipe right, try to get to the first object in the content. And this should be our first item here.
Item 0. Image of Steve Jobs. Button. Double tap to open.
That was pretty good. That gave us a lot of information. This is item 0. It's an image of Steve Jobs. It's a button, and I can double tap this button to open it. I'm going to swipe right again.
Item 1. Image of Steve Jobs. Button. Double tap to open.
Awesome. That is exactly what we want. I'm going to triple tap with 3 fingers to turn my screen curtain off.
Screen curtain off.
And I'm going to say, hey Siri, turn off VoiceOver.
VoiceOver off.
All right. You guys don't have to listen to Siri anymore. That is basically it for this video. There are ways to build custom accessibility rotors. There are some more accessibility features that I have not covered, but I think this is at least a large portion of it. Generally speaking, in your apps, if you can get your text to dynamically resize, you can get your colors right, and you can add just these basic accessibility elements, which honestly, once you know how to use these are pretty easy to add. If you get this chunk going, your app is basically fully accessible. And that is a huge deal for apps, and it's becoming more and more important every single year. We saw in WWDC this year, Apple talked a lot about accessibility. A lot of their features are purposely accessibility driven. That's why we can see all of their native components, like the toggle, comes by default with accessibility. So again, if we can use the native components, we should. But if we are not using native components, we should add accessibility traits and modifiers so that our apps are still accessible. I again hope this helped somebody out there, because accessibility is incredibly important and it's getting more and more important every single year. Let me know in the comments if you learned anything. I know I personally did not know a lot about accessibility until I started implementing it. And now that I know it, I feel much more comfortable that everyone can use my apps, and hopefully everybody can use yours as well. Thank you guys for watching. As always, my name is Nick. This is Swiftful Thinking, and I'll see you in the next video.